What if the Empire of Brazil survived? From 1500 onwards, Brazil was a colony of the Kingdom of Portugal. Though Portugal didn't pay much attention to its colony in the New World at the start, as it was meant as a naval base, it would become profitable and valuable to the Portuguese monarchy thanks to the transatlantic slave trade, in which Portugal bought Congolese slaves with money earned with cash crops in the New World harvested by Congolese slaves. As a matter of fact, Brazil was the country in the New World with the most slaves, containing 40% of all imported slaves in the New World, and would be the last to abolish the institution of slavery, namely in 1888, which is why many Dixiecrats moved to Brazil after the American Civil War. These Southerners are called Confederados. The city they would find is called Americana. In 1807, as part of the Napoleonic Wars, France would invade Portugal together with Spain, which they invaded the next year, and the Portuguese royal family under John VI would flee to Brazil and form the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves, finally making Brazil a co-equal and also improving Brazil as a whole and making Rio de Janeiro a modern city. And once Napoleonic France was defeated in 1814, the Portuguese royal family initially stayed in Brazil. But after chaos broke out in Portugal, they were pressured to return, which caused Brazilians to be scared of losing their status as co-equals, and so the son of the king, Pedro, would declare himself Emperor of Brazil as Pedro I, kicking the Portuguese out of the New World, and unlike Spain, without bloodshed. The Empire of Brazil would be a powerhouse in the New World, especially under his son Pedro II, but would definitely get romanticized in modern pop culture, being seen as the stable monarchy surrounded by instable republics. In 1889, the monarchy would be abolished after a military coup consisting of veterans of the Paraguayan War and former slave owners who were angry at the abolishment of slavery the year prior. The monarchy could definitely be saved, but Pedro himself quickly steps down because he believed that the Brazilian people won't accept an empress, and so the monarchy would die with him. And thus Brazil would become a republic, and though it would lose prestige in the following years as it would be plagued by military juntas and corrupt presidents, and would in fact even become less democratic than under the monarchy, but it is still the most powerful, biggest and most populous Latin American and Portuguese-speaking country in the world, though nothing near a Latin American version of the United States. But what if that didn't happen? What if the Empire of Brazil survived? In this timeline, Pedro Alfonso, son of Pedro II, doesn't die so early, and would become the heir to Emperor Pedro. This causes Pedro not to lose faith in the monarchy, and not to neglect his duties. The monarchy is still strong, and the coup attempt ends in disaster as Pedro refuses to abdicate the throne. In 1891, Pedro II dies, having ruled for over 60 years, making him not only the longest ruling emperor of Brazil, but also the 14th longest ruling monarch in the world. He would be succeeded by Pedro III at the age of 43, who would steer the empire to industrialization and modernization, and would make it a great power in the world. This would also destroy the power of the land-owning elite, which paves the road to more liberalism in the empire. Brazil would become a minor great power, but would still not be able to compete with the big powers like the United States, United Kingdom, France, Germany, or Russia, because they have a relatively small population, though one that is growing fast, and because even in a best-case scenario can't compete with most of these in an industrial level, and would always be behind these great powers. Speaking about its population, they would manage to convince more immigrants, who bring with them new jobs and skills, to migrate to Brazil, especially Italians and Germans who may have migrated to the United States, and especially Argentina instead. In the First World War, the Empire of Brazil would not join the Central Powers as they have nothing to gain except for French and British Guiana, and this is enforced when the United States enter the war. Brazil's biggest trading partners in 1914 were the United States and United Kingdom, and thus the unrestricted submarine warfare would probably also hit a Brazilian ship. They may join the First World War earlier, but this would hardly change anything except for minor victories in the Western Front. In 1923, after ruling for 32 years, Pedro III dies, and unlike his father, he dies without any heir, and so the throne moves to his sister, who died just 2 years earlier. Her oldest son Pedro gave up his titles in 1908 to marry a woman of lower rank similar to Edward VIII, and with her other 2 sons dead as well, the oldest son of her second oldest son, Prince Pedro Henrique, would be crowned as Emperor Pedro IV at the age of 14. Given his age and the fact that he is unready to rule as his father and grandmother just recently died, a regency led by his uncle Pedro de Alcântara is in charge until he is able to rule. The Great Depression would hit Brazil, but so would be the rest of the world, and I think the monarchy would be able to maintain control, and unlike Argentina would manage to recover from the effects of the Great Depression. In the Second World War they once again join on the side of the Allies and contribute ever more, especially in the Italian campaign. And though the chances for this are low, it is possible that after the Cold War it is Brazil, and not France, who gets a permanent seat in the United Nations. Now I know what you are thinking: has Charles lost it completely? Why would Brazil be given a seat, and not France? For that you need to understand that originally only 4 permanent seats were envisioned, namely the United States, Soviet Union, United Kingdom, and China. The United Kingdom and Soviet Union didn't really like the way this was made and wanted a 5th member, and the United States actually offered that seat to Brazil, which rejected it mostly due to financial reasons, and Brazil in this timeline is far wealthier than in our own timeline. However, this is still unlikely because for the Soviets in our own timeline, and probably here as well, Brazil would be too close to the United States. They wanted a 5th member in the first place because the UK and China were closely aligned to the United States, and so would be Brazil, but apparently France is totally fine. As for the United Kingdom, they didn't want to be the sole representative of Western Europe, and wanted someone else to take that position. So it is still unlikely, as the United Kingdom and Soviet Union would still be unhappy, but maybe they could agree on having 6 seats. Given that the other 5 permanent members have nuclear weapons, there is a slim chance that Brazil may develop some of their own. It would be in the Cold War when Brazil would be at its strongest, but a slow when relations with the United States would be at its most tense. Because given that the United States regularly couped Latin American governments if they were deemed to leftist or unfriendly, it is possible that Latin America would flee to the Empire of Brazil instead. As for the Greater Cold War, they are probably non-aligned, but closer to the United States than Soviet Union, given that they are like the United States, democratic and capitalist, and that the Soviets have a tendency of killing royalty. Another place that they could shine is Africa, because compared to the alternatives of dictatorship sponsored by the United States and dictatorship sponsored by the Soviet Union, many African countries may welcome Brazil, which was a colony itself, and has a huge black population of at least 14 million. Furthermore, they are the only great power in the global south. Brazil's sphere of influence would be especially strong in Lusophone Africa and countries along the Atlantic Ocean. In 1981, Pedro IV dies after ruling for 58 years, and for the first time in Brazilian history its new monarch wouldn't be named Pedro, but rather Luiz, and so his son becomes emperor as Luiz I. But with the end of the Cold War, Brazil's sphere of influence in Latin America and Africa would decrease as coups by the US become rarer. For example, the only coup in Latin America by the US after 1991 was in Haiti, namely Operation Uphold Democracy, and 2 in Africa, 1 in Congo, namely the First Congo War, and 1 in Libya, namely in its military intervention in 2011, and thus with them being left mostly alone, they don't run to Brazil anymore. Brazil would become like France, or the United Kingdom, a mediocre power revolving around the United States. In 2022, Louis I dies, having ruled for 41 years, and given that he had no heir, his brother Bertrand becomes emperor as Bertrand I. He too has no son, and so his brother Antonio is his heir. In this timeline, Brazil is a far wealthier than in our own timeline. For the sake of simplicity, let's say they are as wealthy in terms of GDP per capita as the wealthiest country in Latin America, Uruguay, whose average citizen is 2.24 times as wealthy as the average Brazilian. If we transfer that to its GDP, they would have an even bigger one than Japan, but that is of course if the best case scenario happens. Nowadays, Brazil would be by far the most powerful country south of the Equator, with a strong economy, stable government, and its own arsenal of nuclear weapons, only losing in terms of GDP per capita to Australia and New Zealand. Brazil would be outside of the Commonwealth the only country in the New World with a monarch, and with Japan, one of the only 2 countries with an emperor. If you liked the episode, leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe. Goodbye.